5 years ago, she walked away at a gas station and never looked back, leaving me standing there with a newborn and no answers. I didn't shout. I didn't chase. I just learned how quiet betrayal can be. Years later, she came back, not to apologize, but to take something she thought was still hers. That was the moment I realized silence isn't strength forever. If you've ever been pushed past a line you never thought you'd cross, you'll understand why this story still matters. The day started the way most of my days did back then. Early, quiet, and already spoken for by other people's needs. I was up before the sun, pulling on work boots that still smelled faintly of oil and dust, easing the door shut so I wouldn't wake the baby. She was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with her phone in her hand, scrolling through something she didn't bother to explain. When I asked if she needed anything before I left, she said no without looking up. At work, everything stayed predictable. Inspections, paperwork, a brief argument with a subcontractor who tried to cut a corner. I handled it the same way I always did. Calm voice, firm boundary, no raised volume. That approach had kept me employed, respected, and trusted. On my lunch break, I checked my phone. No messages. I sent one asking if she'd eaten, if the baby was okay. The reply came an hour later. We're fine. By the time I drove home, traffic had thickened and my shoulders felt tight in that familiar way that comes from carrying too much and saying too little. She mentioned needing gas and asked if we could stop before heading back. Her tone wasn't sharp, just flat, like she was already somewhere else. I turned off the highway and pulled into a station that sat alone between long stretches of road, the kind of place truckers used late at night. She unbuckled first and said she'd grab a drink inside. I nodded, stayed in the car, and glanced back at our son in his carrier. He was asleep, mouth slightly open, chest moving in short, uneven breaths, the way newborns do. The pump clicked off before I noticed how much time had passed. A few minutes went by, then more. People came and left. I went inside once, scanned the aisles, checked the restroom. Her car keys weren't on the counter. The clerk shook his head when I asked if he'd seen her leave. I stepped back outside and stood next to the car, phone in my hand, dialing and redialing until it went straight to voicemail. Rain started without warning. Not a storm, just enough to soak my jacket and blur the asphalt. I didn't shout her name. I didn't pound on the glass doors. I checked the baby again, adjusted the blanket, moved the car closer to the overhang. Small tasks kept my hands steady. When the reality settled in, it did so quietly. No dramatic rush. Just the understanding that she wasn't coming back. Not tonight. Maybe not ever. I strapped the carrier in, wiped rain off the windshield, and pulled back onto the road. The gas station disappeared behind me like it had never existed. The drive felt longer than it should have. Every red light stretched out. I kept expecting my phone to vibrate with an explanation that would make sense of everything. Nothing came. At a stoplight, the baby stirred and let out a thin cry. I reached back with one hand, resting my fingers against the edge of the carrier until the sound faded. At home, the apartment greeted me the same way it always did. Dim, quiet, unfinished. I carried him inside, set him down, and moved through the routine I'd practiced enough times to do without thinking. Bottle warmed, diaper changed, lights kept low. My reflection in the bathroom mirror looked older than it had that morning. I sat on the couch with him sleeping against my chest and listened to the hum of the refrigerator, the distant traffic, the normal sounds of a life that no longer fit the shape it had been given. Calls went unanswered, messages stayed unread. I typed a few words and deleted them before sending anything. By dawn, exhaustion settled into my bones, heavy and dull. I placed him in his crib and stood there longer than necessary, watching to make sure he kept breathing. Work clothes hung over the chair where I dropped them the night before. The day ahead waited, indifferent and already demanding, and I reached for my phone once more before picking up my keys and stepping back into the hallway with him in my arms. The hallway smelled faintly of cleaning solution and old carpet. I locked the door behind me, shifted the baby higher against my chest, and took the stairs because the elevator felt too slow for a morning that had already fallen behind. Outside, the air pressed heavy against my skin, and the city moved like it always did, unconcerned with who had been left behind overnight. Daycare took some explaining. The woman at the front desk glanced at the empty line where a second signature usually sat and asked, casually, if his mother would be picking him up later. I said no. That single word seemed to invite more questions. Was everything all right at home? Had we updated our emergency contacts? Her pen hovered above the clipboard, while I answered what was necessary and ignored the rest. When I handed my son over, he wrapped his fingers around mine with a grip that surprised me. I stayed a moment longer than required before turning away. Work didn't pause out of courtesy. Emails stacked up. A supervisor asked if I could stay late to cover a shift. I asked for time off instead. The look I got wasn't cruel, just confused, as if responsibility were something that could be rearranged with enough notice. By midday, word had spread that my wife wasn't around. No one said it directly. Conversations softened when I walked by. Offers of help came wrapped in curiosity. Phone calls from her family started that afternoon. I let the first few go unanswered, then picked up one out of obligation more than hope. Her mother's voice carried concern shaped like accusation. She asked where her daughter was, why I hadn't done more, whether I'd said something to push her away. I kept my answers short. Every explanation sounded like an excuse, even to my own ears. By the end of the week, the story had taken on a life of its own. Someone mentioned seeing her back in town. Another claimed she'd been unhappy for a long time. I heard that I worked too much, that I wasn't warm enough, that I must have known something was coming. None of it came from her directly. Silence traveled faster than truth. Evenings blurred together, bottles warmed, laundry folded, alarms set for feeds that came every few hours. Sleep arrived in pieces, never long enough to feel rested. When the baby cried, I moved without thinking, learned his rhythms the way I'd once learned job sites and safety protocols. Holding him upright against my shoulder became instinctive. So did pushing down the ache that came with every unanswered message. At the grocery store, a cashier noticed the diaper bag and asked if I was babysitting. The words stuck in my throat. I paid, nodded, and left before she could apologize. On the drive home, I replayed that moment longer than it deserved. The first person who didn't rush to fill the quiet was Marcus. We'd worked together years ago before he transferred departments. He showed up one evening with a bag of takeout and no questions attached. We sat at the small kitchen table while the baby slept in the other room. He talked about traffic, a broken coffee machine at work. Nothing urgent. When I finally mentioned what had happened, he listened without interrupting. After a while, he asked a single thing. Not where she was, not why she'd left. He wanted to know how long I planned to carry this alone. The question landed harder than any rumor. I didn't have an answer ready. He didn't press for one. Calls from her family continued. Some came with demands. Others arrived coated in concern that felt conditional. I responded when necessary, stayed polite, kept my voice even. Each conversation ended the same way, with the sense that something was expected from me that I couldn't quite name. At work, someone suggested counseling like it was a task I'd forgotten to complete. Another mentioned mediation. Everyone seemed certain there was a right way to handle things, though none of them had to do it while holding a crying infant at 3 a.m. Marcus stopped by again later that week. He helped assemble a crib I'd bought secondhand, and didn't comment on how quiet the apartment felt. As he tightened the last screw, he looked up and said that responsibility wasn't the same as sacrifice without limits. Then he washed his hands and left. That night, after settling the baby back down, I stood in the doorway of the bedroom that still held her clothes. The closet stayed closed. Messages waited on my phone. I set it face down on the counter, poured myself a glass of water, and listened for the sound of my son breathing from the other room, while the city carried on outside, unaware of how alone the quiet had become. The call came while I was rinsing bottles in the sink. I let it ring once, twice, then answered because the number looked local. A woman spoke carefully, like she wasn't sure I was the right person. She said my name, paused, then said she'd met my wife at a clinic across town the week before. Not a hospital, a clinic. She added that my wife mentioned staying with family and waiting for things to calm down. The words sounded practiced. The woman apologized for calling at all and hung up before I could ask where she'd gotten my number. I dried my hands and stared at the counter. The baby fussed from the other room, and I went to him first. After he settled, I sat on the edge of the bed and replayed the call. A clinic didn't match the story I'd been given. Family waiting didn't either. When my phone buzzed later that night, it was her. The conversation stayed short. She said she was safe, needed space, didn't want to argue. I asked where she was. She said that didn't matter right now. The next day, her sister called. She spoke fast, jumped between concern and blame, asked if I'd considered how stressful things had been for her. When I asked again where my wife was staying, the answer shifted. First it was a cousin, then a friend. Each version ended with the same request, to stop asking questions and give her time. Community has a way of closing ranks. People I'd known for years suddenly heard different things. I learned about them secondhand. Someone mentioned I'd refused to let her see the baby. Another said I was controlling. None of it came from me, and none of it reached me directly. Invitations stopped arriving. Conversations ended early. I started noticing who shared information and who didn't. I kept working. I kept showing up. At lunch, I wrote notes on my phone without labeling them as anything important. Dates, times, who said what. I saved every message instead of deleting them to keep my head clear. When her mother texted to say decisions would be made with or without my input, I didn't reply right away. I took a screenshot and set the phone down. Her calls came at odd hours. Each one carried a new boundary I was expected to accept. She asked for updates on the baby, but avoided specifics about her plans. When I mentioned daycare schedules and pediatric appointments, she said I was overstepping. I listened. I asked one question per call and ended it when the answer drifted. Marcus stopped by with coffee one evening and noticed the notebook on the table. He didn't ask what it was for. He just said it was smart to keep track when stories kept changing. Then he asked who else was talking for her. I hadn't considered that fully. The list grew longer once I did. A letter arrived from her family's attorney 2 days later. It used neutral language and carried assumptions I hadn't agreed to. Custody discussions, temporary arrangements, requests framed as expectations. I read it once, folded it, and placed it in the same drawer as the notebook. I didn't call the number at the bottom. At work, a supervisor pulled me aside to ask if everything was stable at home. He said it gently, the way people do when they've already formed an opinion. I told him my performance hadn't changed. He nodded and said he hoped things would settle soon. The baby developed a rash that week. Nothing serious, but it kept me up longer than usual. While I waited for the ointment to work, I scrolled through old messages from her. Patterns emerged once I stopped trying to explain them away. Delays before replies, answers that redirected instead of clarified, promises made without dates attached. I reduced contact to one scheduled call every other day. When she missed one, I didn't chase. When her sister demanded to be added to group messages, I declined without explanation. Each small decision felt unfamiliar, like using muscles I hadn't relied on before. One afternoon, a neighbor mentioned seeing her parents' car parked down the block the previous weekend. The timing didn't line up with what I'd been told. I thanked him and went inside. I wrote the date down and closed the notebook. By Friday, the sense of order I'd built my life around no longer held. Rules changed depending on who spoke. Authority shifted without notice. I adjusted anyway. I lined up childcare backups. I called a lawyer recommended by Marcus and left a message without urgency. The phone stayed silent afterward. That night, after the baby fell asleep, I sat at the table and organized the drawer. Messages printed, notes stacked, the letter placed on top. I didn't feel angry so much as alert. Something was moving beneath the surface, and I was no longer willing to be the last one to know about it as I turned the page and wrote the next time and date. The email came from the community center just after I dropped my son at daycare. It announced a family mediation meeting, open to members and relatives, scheduled for that afternoon. My name was listed alongside hers. No one had asked if I would attend. The wording assumed I would. I went anyway, straight from work, boots still dusty, shirt wrinkled from a long day. The room was already half full when I arrived. Familiar faces turned toward me, some curious, some cautious. She sat near the front with her mother and sister, shoulders drawn in, hands folded like she was bracing herself. The sight of her didn't hit the way I'd imagined. It felt distant, like seeing someone through glass. She spoke first. Her voice shook at the right moments. She said leaving had been the only way to breathe. She said she'd been afraid. She said she'd tried to reach out but felt shut out. Each sentence landed softly, designed to be caught and carried by the people listening. Heads nodded. A few murmurs of sympathy followed. When someone asked me to respond, I stood without rushing. Words stayed brief. I said our son was safe. I said routines were in place. I said decisions had been made without my knowledge. I didn't explain how nights worked or what it took to keep everything moving. The room wanted a story. I gave facts. Questions followed anyway. Why hadn't I pushed harder to find her? Why hadn't I involved her family sooner? Each one came wrapped in concern, but the edge was there. I answered what applied and let the rest pass. Silence grew uncomfortable, not for me, but for the people waiting for more. That's when she shifted. Tears appeared without warning. She talked about feeling erased, about being painted as careless. She mentioned my job, how demanding it was, how alone she'd felt. Someone near the back whispered something about priorities. I recognized the move for what it was. The ground tilted, and I was suddenly the one being examined. Later that week, consequences showed up where I worked. A project I'd led was reassigned pending review. No accusation attached, just a pause, until things stabilized. The explanation stayed vague. I didn't argue. I asked who would handle my responsibilities and stepped aside when told. Messages from acquaintances filled my phone. Some offered support. Others asked pointed questions about what kind of man lets his family fall apart in public. I responded selectively. Most went unanswered. Time was better spent elsewhere. At the grocery store, a neighbor stopped me near the checkout and said she hoped everything worked out. Her tone suggested I was the obstacle. I nodded, paid, and left with the cart rattling louder than usual. That evening, daycare called to say pickup arrangements needed updating. A new authorization had been submitted listing additional contacts. I asked who'd sent it. They named her sister. I corrected the record, signed the necessary forms, and asked for copies of everything. The administrator hesitated, then complied. Marcus called later and asked how the meeting went. I told him it was efficient. He didn't laugh. He said efficiency often favors the person who speaks first and cries better. Then he asked what I planned to do next. I said I needed to think. The next public moment came faster than expected. A community fundraiser posted photos online. She was in several of them, holding a microphone, speaking about resilience. Comments poured in. My name appeared once, buried halfway down, framed as context rather than presence. I closed the app and turned my phone off. Sleep didn't come easily that night. The baby stirred more than usual. I walked the apartment with him pressed against my shoulder, pacing until his breathing slowed. Each step reminded me how much of my life had been spent absorbing impact meant for someone else. By morning, clarity arrived without ceremony. I called the lawyer whose number had been sitting in my drawer and scheduled a consultation. I forwarded emails. I printed screenshots. At work, I requested a formal review instead of waiting for one to be assigned. That afternoon, as I buckled my son into his car seat, a text came through from her asking if we could talk things through privately, away from everyone else. I read it once, set the phone face down, and pulled out of the parking lot, already late for the next obligation that wouldn't wait. The voicemail waited when I turned my phone back on, clipped and deliberate. The voice didn't give a name. It mentioned a date, a conversation I barely remembered, and a detail no one outside our marriage should have known. The message ended with a suggestion to check old emails, and a warning that not everything had started the night she left. I listened twice, then opened the archive I hadn't touched in years. Back when things first began to strain, I'd saved messages out of habit, not suspicion. Scrolling through them now felt different. Patterns surfaced without effort, promises that evaporated, plans shifted last minute, money moved without clear reasons. A line from a message she'd sent years earlier caught my eye. Something about keeping things simple until it's sorted. I'd read past it at the time. It read like a placeholder now. A memory followed, sharp and inconvenient. A conversation in the kitchen, long before the baby arrived, when she'd asked about putting accounts under one name to make things easier. I'd agreed without much thought. It sounded practical. Trust had filled in the gaps where questions should have been. The anonymous number texted again while I was at work, this time with a photo attached. Not dramatic, just paperwork. A form with dates that didn't line up, and a signature I recognized. My chest tightened, not from shock, but from recognition. This wasn't new behavior. It was old, refined by repetition. I didn't reply. I forwarded the message to the lawyer and kept moving through the day. Tasks waited. Meetings ran long. People spoke around me, and I nodded where appropriate. The sense of balance I'd clung to finally tipped, not into panic, but into clarity. Marcus called that evening. He didn't ask for details. He asked what the options were. I told him what I'd learned and what it suggested. He listened, then said the quiet part out loud. That staying neutral had become a choice in itself, one that kept costing me ground. He didn't tell me what to do. He pointed at the exit I'd been avoiding. The pressure outside tightened. A post appeared online questioning my fitness as a parent, framed as concern. It spread faster than I expected. Comments multiplied. Some people tagged others. My name sat there, discussed by people who'd never watched me pace a hallway at 2 a.m. with a feverish child. I documented it all. Screenshots joined the growing stack. When daycare called again about conflicting instructions, I sent them a formal notice through the lawyer and requested confirmation in writing. The calls stopped after that. She reached out directly, this time through a friend, asking to meet somewhere neutral. I declined and suggested all communication go through counsel. The response came back emotional, accusing me of turning things hostile. I saved it and went back to assembling the crib rail that had come loose. Another message arrived from the anonymous number with a time and place, public, mid-morning. I hesitated, then agreed to listen, nothing more. The cafe sat near the courthouse, busy enough to stay impersonal. The man who slid into the seat across from me looked ordinary. He didn't waste time. He'd worked with her family briefly. He said he'd stepped away when requests crossed lines. He shared what he had and explained why he was done staying quiet. I asked questions. He answered what he could and admitted what he didn't know. When we parted, my hands shook just enough to notice. The fear didn't last. It gave way to resolve shaped by facts. Back home, I laid everything out on the table. Documents, notes, timelines. The story assembled itself without drama. I saw where I'd stepped aside and where others had stepped in. The realization hurt less than expected. Pain needs uncertainty to linger. That night, after the baby fell asleep, I drafted a statement with the lawyer's guidance. No accusations, no character attacks, just boundaries and intent, custody requests, financial clarity, a halt to third-party interference. I read it once and sent it. The reply came quickly, angry and unfocused. I didn't respond. Instead, I packed the diaper bag for the morning, checked the calendar, and set reminders for appointments that had already been confirmed. The phone buzzed again while I tightened the strap on the carrier. I let it sit and lifted my son from the crib, feeling the weight of him settle in a way that felt steadier than it had in weeks as paperwork took over the kitchen table. Not all at once, not in a dramatic sweep, but in steady layers, one envelope at a time, one document reviewed, scanned, and placed into a folder with a handwritten label. I learned which forms mattered and which ones only looked official. The lawyer's emails stayed brief and direct. Follow this, keep that, don't respond yet. Finances came next. Accounts I hadn't checked closely in years needed attention. Statements told their own story once I stopped skimming. Transfers lined up with moments I remembered as stressful but manageable. I moved what was left into a new structure, transparent and dull, the kind that didn't invite questions. Bills went on autopay, alerts turned on. Nothing flashy, just stable. Work settled into a different rhythm. I arrived earlier, left on time, stopped volunteering for problems that weren't mine. Colleagues noticed the shift but didn't comment. My supervisor approved a schedule adjustment without debate. Productivity stayed high. That seemed to be enough. Messages from unknown numbers started slipping through. Most said nothing. A few carried vague warnings, advice dressed up as concern. I didn't reply. Screenshots joined the archive. Dates went into the notebook. Patterns formed. Silence proved useful once it stopped being passive. Marcus checked in every few days. He didn't ask how I felt. He asked what had moved forward. We talked logistics over short calls while I walked the baby around the block or waited in the car outside daycare. He reminded me to back things up in more than one place. I followed the advice. The first sign that someone was paying attention came on a Tuesday morning. A car I didn't recognize idled near the building longer than necessary. I noticed it because everything else had started to slow down. When it drove off, I wrote the color and time down without assigning meaning. Later that week, a text arrived from her sister asking why I'd cut off communication. I answered with a single sentence about counsel and schedules. The reply came fast and sharp. I saved it and went back to folding laundry. Court filings moved forward quietly. Deadlines replaced conversations. Each step reduced the space for improvisation on both sides. I didn't celebrate that. I adjusted to it. Control feels different when it's procedural. At night, after my son fell asleep, I reviewed notes instead of scrolling. Fatigue still showed up, but it didn't cloud judgment the way it used to. Decisions came easier once they stopped revolving around approval. I learned how much energy had gone into managing reactions that were never going to soften. Another message from an unknown number arrived while I was on a conference call. It referenced the meeting at the community center and suggested I'd regret escalating things. I forwarded it to the lawyer and muted the thread. The call continued. No one noticed the change. Daycare asked for an updated emergency plan. I provided one that listed fewer names and clearer instructions. The administrator thanked me for being organized. That word stuck. Organized sounded safer than angry or bitter. I preferred it. On Friday, I spotted the same car again, this time near my office. It didn't follow when I left. I noted it anyway. Paranoia wasn't useful. Awareness was. She tried calling that evening. I let it ring out and watched the screen until it went dark. A voicemail followed, tight with frustration. She said things were getting out of hand and asked why I was making it harder than it needed to be. I didn't listen to the rest until later, then saved it with the others. The baby developed a cough that night, mild but persistent. I propped him up, checked his temperature, and called the pediatrician's after-hours line. While I waited for a call back, I drafted a list of questions for the lawyer's next meeting. Custody timelines, communication boundaries, enforcement options. The call came. Instructions given, notes taken. The cough eased. I held him until his breathing steadied, then laid him back down and washed my hands. Before bed, I locked the folders away and cleared the table. Tomorrow's clothes were set out, bottles lined up, the phone charged face down. Outside, a car passed slowly and kept going. I turned off the light, lay back, and ran through the next day's schedule once more, already adjusting for changes I hadn't been told about yet. The notice was waiting when I opened my email at work. Subject line marked, urgent. A temporary motion had been filed overnight, requesting immediate changes to custody and access. The language was careful, almost polite, but the effect landed hard. Until a hearing, pickups would be supervised. Decisions would be shared through intermediaries. My name appeared everywhere, paired with phrases like potential instability and ongoing conflict. I closed the office door and read it again, slower this time. Each sentence tightened the space I'd been standing in. Calls followed before I could process the first message. Daycare needed clarification. My supervisor asked if I could step into a meeting. The lawyer left a voicemail asking me not to respond to anyone yet. By lunchtime, her mother had called twice and left a message that sounded less concerned than triumphant. She said this was for the baby's safety and hoped I'd cooperate. I deleted nothing. Everything went into the same folder that had started to feel heavier than paper should. The real blow came that afternoon. A social worker showed up at the apartment while I was still at the office. A neighbor called to let me know someone official was asking questions. By the time I got home, a card waited on the counter with a number to call. My hand shook just enough to notice as I picked up the phone. The interview stayed procedural. Questions about routines, support systems, stress levels. I answered clearly and kept my voice even. When it ended, the silence in the apartment felt louder than usual. I sat on the floor with my back against the couch and stared at the wall until the baby stirred. That evening, I strapped him into the car seat and drove without a destination for a while. Traffic crawled, horns sounded, none of it registered. All I could think about was how close I'd come to losing ground I hadn't realized was still mine. Her message arrived while I was stopped at a red light. She said this wasn't what she wanted, that things had gone too far, that people were advising her to protect herself. She suggested we pause everything and talk privately before more damage was done. The words blurred together. I didn't reply. At home, I fed the baby and watched him focus on the bottle like it was the only thing that mattered. That steadiness cracked something open in me. For the first time since the gas station, fear pushed past restraint. Not panic, but the sharp awareness that silence had become a liability. I called Marcus and didn't wait for him to ask questions. The words came out unevenly, facts stacked without order. He listened, then said what he'd been holding back for weeks. That waiting for fairness to show up on its own wasn't the same as protecting my son. He told me to stop assuming restraint would be read as cooperation. The lawyer called back later and laid out options: emergency responses, requests for review, Steps that would escalate things, but also anchor them in process. I paced while we talked, stepping over toys and laundry piles, trying to keep my voice steady. When the call ended, I stood in the kitchen longer than necessary, phone still in my hand. That night stretched on. The baby woke more often, unsettled by something I couldn't name. I moved between rooms, checked locks, reread the notice. Fatigue crept in, heavy and disorienting. At one point, I leaned against the counter and felt tears rise without warning. They didn't fall. They hovered, then retreated, leaving behind a dull pressure. Around 3 in the morning, I sat at the table and opened the folder again. Dates lined up. Messages contradicted each other. Claims collapsed under their own weight once arranged side by side. The picture was clear enough to act on, even if the outcome wasn't guaranteed. I drafted a response with the lawyer's template pulled up on my laptop. Each sentence felt deliberate, stripped of emotion, anchored in evidence. When I hesitated, I thought about the social worker's card and the supervised visits that hadn't happened yet, but already felt real. The final step waited at the bottom of the screen. Filing would trigger a chain reaction I couldn't undo. My finger hovered over the trackpad. In the other room, the baby let out a soft sound, not a cry, just a reminder of presence. I saved the document, picked him up, and held him until his breathing slowed again. Back at the table, I reopened the file, checked the attachments one more time, and sent it through the secure portal before the clock hit 4. Then closed the laptop and started the coffee maker, already planning the morning drop-off, under rules that were about to change. The email arrived without a subject line, sent from an address I didn't recognize. It held a single attachment and a sentence that read, "I wasn't sure when to send this. I think now is the right time." I didn't open it right away. Coffee brewed, bottles warmed, shoes got tied. The morning followed its sequence before I circled back. The attachment turned out to be a scanned document, dated years earlier than the night she left. It showed a filing I'd never seen, tied to an address that wasn't ours and an account I didn't control. A name appeared at the bottom, someone I remembered meeting once at a family gathering, quiet and forgettable. The details lined up with the gaps I'd been skirting around for weeks. I forwarded it to the lawyer and waited. The reply came faster than usual. He asked where it came from. I told him the truth, that I didn't know yet. He asked if I could get more. I said I'd try. The sender answered my follow-up with a short explanation. He'd been asked to hold paperwork and keep quiet. He'd done that until requests changed tone. When pressure replaced politeness, he stepped back. He didn't want involvement. He wanted distance. The document was all he felt comfortable sharing. That was enough. The timeline adjusted itself once the piece dropped into place. Transfers that had looked careless now read as deliberate. Decisions that seemed impulsive revealed planning. Even the public performance at the community center fit differently once I stopped taking it at face value. She continued to deny everything. Her statements stayed confident, dismissive even. Posts online framed her as cooperative and misunderstood. Friends echoed the language. It worked on the surface. People like a clean story. I didn't argue with any of it. Instead, I cross-checked dates and matched signatures. The lawyer built a matrix that showed contradictions without commentary. He advised patience. He also advised precision. A notice came setting the date for the next hearing. Preparation shifted from gathering to arranging. Exhibits labeled. Statements refined. Witnesses listed without drama. I learned which facts carried weight and which only felt important. At daycare, a staff member mentioned seeing my wife's cousin drop by earlier in the week asking questions. I thanked her for letting me know and asked that any inquiries be redirected through official channels. She agreed without hesitation. Clarity helps people do their jobs. Marcus stopped by with dinner one night and listened while I explained what had surfaced. He nodded, then asked what the other side was likely to do next. We talked through possibilities the way we used to talk through work problems. Cause, effect, margin for error. It felt familiar in a way I hadn't expected. The pressure didn't ease. If anything, it sharpened. A letter arrived accusing me of withholding information. Another warned against misrepresentation. Each one landed softer than the last. The pattern had become predictable. I spent a morning at the courthouse reviewing files. Names repeated. Addresses overlapped. The clerk didn't offer commentary, just stamped and returned copies. Process stripped things down to what could be proven. That afternoon, she called again. Her voice carried a new edge, less practiced, more defensive. She asked what I thought I was doing. I told her the truth, that I was following the procedure laid out. She said I was trying to ruin her. I said nothing and let the silence work. After the call ended, I sat in the car for a moment longer than usual, not to collect myself, but to organize what came next. The weak point wasn't emotion. It wasn't public opinion. It was the record. Paper doesn't bend to tone. At home, I laid out the materials in order, this time without hesitation. The missing piece changed how everything fit. It didn't make the situation easier, it made it clearer. That night, after settling my son, I drafted questions for the hearing. Not arguments, questions designed to pull the thread. The lawyer reviewed them and made small adjustments, cutting anything that invited spectacle. I set the alarm earlier than necessary and packed the diaper bag with the same care I'd used all week. When I turned off the light, the documents stayed on the table, stacked and ready. In the quiet that followed, I ran through the sequence once more. Not to reassure myself, but to make sure nothing had been overlooked as I closed the door behind me and reached for my keys. The hearing room stayed quiet longer than expected. Papers shuffled, chairs scraped once, then settled. I took the seat beside my lawyer and rested my hands on the table, palms down, the way I'd learned to do when steady mattered more than comfort. She sat across from me with her attorney, posture tight, jaw set. The family members who'd filled rooms before weren't there this time. Process narrows the audience. The judge opened with routine questions. Names confirmed, motions acknowledged. No speeches, no invitations to perform. When she spoke, her voice carried confidence that sounded practiced, but thinner than before. She talked about fear, about instability, about needing protection. The words landed in the room and stayed there, unsupported. My lawyer responded without raising his voice. He asked for permission to submit exhibits. The clerk accepted the stack and began distributing copies. Dates appeared, amounts aligned, addresses repeated. The judge paused to read, then asked the question that didn't point toward anyone's feelings. Her attorney objected, citing relevance. The judge overruled and asked another question, this one about timing. I watched her face change, not dramatically, just enough to notice the shift from certainty to calculation. She answered quickly, then corrected herself. The correction contradicted the document in front of her. The next exhibit followed, then the next. Each one reduced the space available for improvisation. The narrative she'd relied on began to fray at the edges, not because I challenged it, but because the record did. My lawyer asked questions designed to confirm facts already written down. Short answers were required. Longer ones weren't allowed. At one point, she tried to redirect, bringing up my work schedule, my temperament, the night she left. The judge listened, then asked how that explained the filings made months earlier. Silence stretched. Her attorney leaned in and whispered. She nodded and tried again, this time blaming confusion. The room didn't react. That absence of response carried weight. I felt the old ache rise when the gas station came up. The baby mentioned as leverage instead of responsibility. The memory pressed in, sharp but brief. It passed without pulling me under. When my turn came, I stood and answered the questions put to me. I didn't offer context unless asked. I described routines, not sacrifices. I named procedures, not motives. The judge asked about communication. I explained the schedule, the boundaries, the reasons they existed. Nothing more. Her last attempt came late, framed as a concern for the child's emotional well-being. She spoke quickly, trying to gather momentum. The judge stopped her mid-sentence and asked for evidence. None appeared. The request moved on. A recess was called. In the hallway, she approached with a look I hadn't seen before. Urgent, stripped of performance. She said we didn't need to do this, that we could fix it quietly. I told her to speak with counsel and returned to my seat when the clerk called us back. The ruling followed without ceremony. Temporary orders revised, supervision lifted, decision-making clarified, third-party interference addressed directly. The language stayed neutral, the effect unmistakable. The judge reminded everyone that compliance mattered more than intent. When it ended, people gathered their things. Her attorney spoke to mine in low tones. She stayed seated, staring at the table as if something there might change if she waited long enough. I signed where instructed and thanked the clerk. Outside, my phone buzzed with messages I didn't open. I walked to the car and sat for a moment, hands resting on the wheel. No relief washed over me. No victory surged. There was only the sense of weight redistributed, placed where it belonged. At daycare, the administrator met me with a revised copy of the orders and asked for confirmation. I provided it and signed. She smiled, professional and brief. My son reached for me when I appeared, face bright with recognition. I lifted him and felt the familiar shift, the quiet recalibration that came with his weight. In the parking lot, a call came through from an unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. The message arrived seconds later, fragmented and angry. I didn't save it this time. At home, I set the papers in the drawer and cleared the table again. Dinner warmed. Bottles lined up. The routine resumed without commentary. While I adjusted the carrier straps for the morning, a knock sounded from the hallway, light and uncertain, and I paused long enough to check the clock before reaching for the door handle, already thinking about the next hour's schedule. The apartment felt different once the paperwork stopped moving. Not quieter, just settled. The drawer where I kept the documents stayed closed for days at a time. When it opened, it was for reference, not reassurance. Orders were followed, schedules held. Messages came less often and carried less weight. I noticed the change in smaller ways. Mornings ran smoother once I stopped anticipating interruptions. Decisions took less time when they no longer needed to be defended in advance. The urge to explain myself faded without effort. I hadn't realized how much energy went into wanting to be seen as reasonable. The weakness showed itself one afternoon while talking to Marcus. He congratulated me, casually, like this was another task completed. I brushed it off and kept the conversation practical. After we hung up, the feeling lingered. Not pride, not relief. Something closer to embarrassment. I'd wanted acknowledgement more than I cared to admit. From him, from her, from anyone who might confirm I hadn't imagined the imbalance. That realization stayed with me longer than the conflict had. It followed me through grocery aisles and work meetings, through late-night feeds and early alarms. The pattern was obvious once named. I'd confused endurance with virtue. I'd mistaken silence for strength. Neither held up when examined. Her situation unraveled in stages. Not publicly, not all at once. Access narrowed. Accounts froze. Invitations stopped coming. Family support fractured under the weight of facts no one wanted to carry alone. I didn't monitor any of it closely. Updates reached me through formal channels, stripped of commentary. That distance mattered. One request came through counsel, asking for a private conversation. I declined without elaboration. Another followed weeks later, framed as closure. The answer stayed the same. Closure didn't require contact. It required consistency. At work, the reassigned project returned to my desk. No apology attached. Just a note asking if I could take it back on. I reviewed the scope, adjusted the timeline, and agreed. The job had never been the problem. The baby grew heavier, louder, more opinionated about everything from naps to food. His laugh filled spaces that had once echoed. Watching him figure things out made it easier to forgive myself for not knowing sooner how to draw lines. One evening, after putting him to bed, I went through the apartment with a box and packed away items that no longer belonged to the life we were living. Clothes went to donation. Photos stayed but moved to a place that didn't demand attention. The last thing in the box was a spare set of keys I'd kept out of habit. I dropped them at the front desk the next morning without a note. The final legal update arrived on a Tuesday, concise and unremarkable. Compliance confirmed. No further action required. I read it once and archived it with the others. The drawer closed with a soft click. Later that day, daycare called to say he'd taken his first unassisted steps. I left work early and arrived in time to see him wobble across the mat, arms out, determined and unbothered by the fall that followed. I clapped, picked him up, and felt the familiar recalibration settle in. That night, while cleaning up after dinner, I caught my reflection in the window. Older than before, quieter too. The need to be understood didn't surface, neither did anger. What remained was usable. Before bed, I checked the calendar and cleared a reminder that no longer applied. The phone stayed face down. Tomorrow's clothes were set out, bottles prepped, lights turned off one by one. In the dark, listening to the steady rhythm from the crib, I thought about how much of my life had been shaped by reacting. That chapter had ended without ceremony. The next one didn't announce itself. It waited, patient and ordinary, in the morning routine already forming as I reached to silence the alarm before it woke him.